There exists a photograph taken in 1851 on a sprawling plantation in the Deep South, a family portrait that appears to show a prosperous white family of 12, arranged formally for the camera. But embedded in that single frame lies a secret so disturbing that it took 174 years for historians and genealogists to uncover the truth. The official plantation records listed these individuals as family members, legitimate heirs, and titled residents. Yet local oral histories whispered of something far darker, a deliberate program of forced reproduction, orchestrated by the plantation's patriarch, that blurred every line between master and enslaved, between family and property. A woman named Martha, the enslaved midwife who delivered every child born on those grounds, carried the knowledge in her memory alone, knowledge that only surfaced when her great-great-granddaughter discovered fragmented notes in a church archive in 2023. This is the story of how one photograph became evidence of systematic deception, how silence protected wealth and legacy, and how the truth, when finally unearthed, shattered everything the family's descendants believed about themselves. Chapter 1. The Photograph that Asks Questions. Há 174 anos, em uma plantação isolada no interior da Geórgia, fotógrafo profissional foi contratado para imortalizar o que parecia ser uma dinastia familiar próspera. A imagem, preservada em arquivos do condado, mostra 12 pessoas arrumadas com precisão militar. Homens em trajes escuros, mulheres em vestidos de seda, crianças posicionadas estrategicamente. Tudo parecia normal, convencional até, para a época. Mas documentos militares e registros de genealogia mencionaram posteriormente um caso tão perturbador que acabou enterrado em silêncio durante gerações. The photograph itself is unremarkable to the untrained eye. 12 figures stand before a wooden mansion, their expressions frozen in the formal solemnity that photography demanded in the mid-19th century. The patriarch, Nathaniel Wright, occupies the center, a broad-shouldered man with a stern face, his hand resting proprietarily on a young woman's shoulder. Around him are arrayed what official records identified as his wife, his 7 biological children, and 3 additional family members. The photograph was catalogued, filed away, and referenced in countless genealogical studies as evidence of the Wright family's prominence and fecundity. What the photograph did not reveal was the architecture of lie beneath its surface. For 174 years, no one questioned the inconsistencies. Why did certain children share features with enslaved workers on the plantation? Why did some family members disappear from subsequent records? Why did Nathaniel Wright's wife, Eleanor, appear increasingly isolated and withdrawn in later correspondence? These questions remained dormant, locked away in the collective unconscious of a region built on erasure and denial. It was only when a genealogist named Dr. Elena Carver cross-referenced census records, deed transfers, and fragmentary oral histories in 2023 that the photograph began to whisper its true story. Hidden in the archives of a rural Baptist church, she discovered a leather-bound journal with water-stained pages and entries written in a careful, educated hand, despite belonging to a woman who had been denied any formal schooling. The journal belonged to Martha, the enslaved midwife who had delivered every child born on the Wright plantation between 1828 and 1862. In its pages, written in coded language and cautious phrases to avoid incrimination, Martha had documented what she alone knew with absolute certainty: the paternity, the coercion, the systematic violation of everything the photograph claimed to represent. The discovery sent shockwaves through academic circles and genealogical communities. The photograph, suddenly, became a crime scene frozen in time. Each face, each carefully arranged body, each precisely positioned hand now demanded interrogation. Who was truly related? Who had been claimed falsely? who had been erased deliberately from history? And most importantly, how had an entire community conspired to protect these secrets for nearly 2 centuries? Before we continue, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 2. The Machinery of a Plantations Dynasty. The Wright plantation sprawled across 400 acres in a rural county in Georgia, positioned along a tributary that fed the broader agricultural economy of the antebellum South. It was not the largest plantation in the region, nor the most lavishly appointed, but it was strategically significant, well-connected politically, financially stable, and remarkably self-contained. Nathaniel Wright, born in 1798, had inherited the land and its enslaved labor force from his father in 1820 at the age of 22. By the time of the 1851 photograph, he had transformed the operation into a thriving commercial enterprise specializing in cotton production and timber export. The official historical record portrays Nathaniel as a relatively moderate enslaver, a man who maintained meticulous records, paid his debts punctually, and was never accused of public brutality. This reputation was cultivated deliberately. He sat on county councils, attended church regularly, and positioned himself as a pillar of Christian morality. His correspondence, preserved in regional archives, reveals a man obsessed with legitimacy, propriety, and the appearance of orderly governance. He kept detailed ledgers cataloging every enslaved person on his property, their ages, their labor assignments, their purchase prices. Yet these same ledgers contained deliberate omissions and strategic ambiguities that would later puzzle researchers. The plantation's infrastructure was designed for maximum control and isolation. The main house occupied a rise overlooking the grounds, positioned so that every movement of the enslaved labor force could be observed from its windows. A system of smaller structures radiated outward: the quarters where enslaved people lived, the workshop, the smokehouse, the overseer's cabin, and, crucially, a small building set apart from the others, the infirmary, where Martha conducted her work as midwife and healer. Martha had arrived on the plantation in 1825, purchased along with her mother for a sum Nathaniel recorded precisely in his ledger. She was 14 years old. Over the next 37 years, Martha would deliver 147 children on the Wright plantation. Her hands attended to births in the quarters, in the main house, and in the infirmary. She was, in every practical sense, the guardian of life and knowledge on that isolated piece of land. She understood nutrition, herbal remedies, and the mechanics of pregnancy. More importantly, she possessed an authority that transcended the formal hierarchies of enslavement. Women in labor, regardless of their status, depended utterly upon her knowledge. Enslaved women sought her counsel, and Eleanor Wright, the plantation mistress, called upon her services repeatedly throughout her marriage. It was Martha's position at this intersection of power, between enslaved and enslavers, between life-giving knowledge and institutional ignorance, that allowed her to perceive truths that the official record systematically obscured. She understood, through her proximity to the bodies and the intimate confessions of labor, what the ledgers could not acknowledge. She witnessed the machinery of the plantation not merely as a system of labor extraction, but as a deliberate engine of reproductive control. This was the knowledge she would later attempt to preserve in her coded journal, knowing that speaking openly would result in her own destruction. Chapter 3. The First Whispers. The 1851 photograph was commissioned by Nathaniel Wright himself, who saw it as a necessary investment in his family's legacy. He had recently secured significant financing for an expansion of his timber operations and wanted to present an image of stability and dynastic continuity to his creditors and political allies. The photographer, a man named Samuel Hutchins, who traveled throughout Georgia taking portraits of prominent families, spent 2 days on the plantation arranging the composition. Hutchins would later recall in a memoir published in 1889 that the shoot had been unusually complicated and that Nathaniel had been unusually particular about the positioning of certain family members. What Hutchins did not note, what he could not have been expected to understand, was that Nathaniel's careful arrangement was itself a performance of lies. The woman standing to Nathaniel's right was identified in the photograph's caption as his wife, Eleanor. But the young man positioned behind her, approximately 16 years old, with features noticeably darker than the other family members, was not her biological son. The 2 children closest to Nathaniel in the photograph, a boy and girl, approximately 12 and 10 respectively, shared a startling physical resemblance to a woman who had been enslaved on the property for years and whose name did not appear in any official family documentation. In the decades following the photograph's creation, inconsistencies began to accumulate in the historical record. Census documents from 1860 listed 12 people living in the main house, yet deed transfers and property records referenced only 9 family members by name. A genealogist compiling the Wright family history in 1924 noted in her unpublished notes, preserved in a university archive, that certain entries in the county records appear contradictory and that several family members seem to have disappeared from the record entirely. But these observations were treated as clerical errors, archival confusion, the inevitable gaps of historical documentation. No one thought to ask whether the gaps were deliberate. The oral history of the region, however, told a different story. In the enslaved quarters, in stories passed down through families who had escaped or been freed, a different narrative persisted. The grandmother of a woman named Sarah Washington, who had been enslaved on the Wright plantation as a child, had spoken of the secret children, the babies born to enslaved women whose fathers were never named, but whose features bore unmistakable marks of the patriarch's bloodline. These stories were told quietly, in hushed tones, in the safe spaces of churches and family gatherings, decades after emancipation. They were stories that the official record had no mechanism to acknowledge or preserve. By the early 20th century, several extended members of the Wright family had dispersed geographically. Some moved north, seeking escape from the degradation of Jim Crow. Others remained in Georgia, integrating into the middle class, their ancestry from the plantation becoming a buried, uncomfortable secret. In 1967, a descendant named James Wright, Jr., who had become a civil rights lawyer, commissioned a private genealogist to research his family history. The genealogist produced a 400-page report that contained numerous inconsistencies and unresolved questions about family relationships. James Jr. read the report, expressed his discomfort to close family members, and then stored it away, never to be published or widely circulated. He would later tell a close friend that he had discovered something that the family preferred to remain undiscovered. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 4. Martha's Coded Knowledge. The journal that Dr. Elena Carver discovered in 2023 bore no name on its cover. Its pages were brittle, yellowed, and in several places water damaged to the point of illegibility. But the handwriting, once decoded, revealed a woman of remarkable literacy, surprising and inexplicable for someone who had been enslaved and denied formal education. How Martha had learned to read and write became, in itself, a mystery that researchers would spend months attempting to unravel. The hypothesis that emerged, based on fragmentary evidence, was that Eleanor Wright, despite her position as plantation mistress, had taught Martha secretly, perhaps out of loneliness, perhaps out of a desperate need for genuine connection in a marriage increasingly marked by coercion and violation. The earliest entries in Martha's journal dated from 1841, more than a decade into her service on the plantation. The first legible passage read, "The master called for me today to examine her. She is with child again, though he swears to his creditors she is not. I am to say nothing. This is what I am for, to know and to say nothing." The entries that followed, written in a deliberately obscure style that combined standard English with phrases in Gula and coded references, documented a pattern of reproductive coercion that scholars would later recognize as a systematic program of forced reproduction. Between 1828 and 1862, Nathaniel Wright fathered at least 7 children with enslaved women on his plantation. This was not unusual for the era. Sexual violence against enslaved women was endemic to plantation slavery. But what Martha's journal revealed was that Nathaniel had done something more calculated and more deliberate than opportunistic abuse. He had engineered a deliberate program of reproduction, selecting specific women based on their physical characteristics, managing their pregnancies, and then determining the fates of the resulting children. Some were kept on the plantation and integrated into the household. Others were sold at strategic moments. Still others were placed with relatives in neighboring counties with falsified documentation, suggesting they were adopted or apprenticed rather than enslaved. Martha documented these transactions in coded language. An entry from 1847 read, "The child born to R in March was collected by the cousin within a fortnight. The master instructed that documents be prepared suggesting the boy was apprenticed to learn carpentry. R has been moved to the fields. She will not recover her heart." Another entry from 1852, written shortly after the photograph had been taken, was more direct. "The photograph lies. All photographs lie, but this one lies systematically. I counted 12, and I know the blood of 6 of them. The master's blood flows through veins he does not acknowledge. The mistress knows. I have seen her weeping in the garden at dusk, when she thinks no one observes. Oui." What emerged from Martha's fragmented testimony was a portrait of Eleanor Wright, not as a passive victim, but as a woman trapped in complicity. Eleanor had known of her husband's systematic violation of the enslaved women on the plantation. More disturbingly, Eleanor had participated in the process, selecting certain women for specific reproductive purposes, arranging adoptions and transfers, maintaining the fiction of family legitimacy, while her husband created a hidden genealogy of violence. The 1851 photograph represented the culmination of this system. By that time, Eleanor had borne only 4 biological children to Nathaniel. The other 8 people in the photograph, the ones positioned carefully to appear as family members, represented the hybrid population that Nathaniel had engineered. Some his biological children with enslaved women, some adopted, some placed there strategically to obscure the truth. Martha's journal eventually documented what happened to each child in the photograph. 3 were sold to relatives in other states before reaching adulthood. One died of an infection in 1854, and his death was recorded in plantation records as an accident. 2 eventually fled north during the chaos of the Civil War and disappeared into urban populations, their identities deliberately obscured. Only 3 of the family members in the photograph remained on the plantation through the end of the war and into the Reconstruction era. Those 3 would become the ancestors of the modern Wright family, carrying within their bloodlines a genealogy of violence and erasure that they themselves were never permitted to acknowledge. Chapter 5. The silence deepens. The American Civil War intervened in the summer of 1861, arriving suddenly and catastrophically for families like the Wrights. Federal forces swept through rural Georgia in a campaign of total war, burning plantations, confiscating property, and liberating enslaved populations. The Wright plantation was destroyed in 1864 by Union cavalry advancing toward Atlanta. The main house was burned, the fields were rendered barren, and the enslaved population, those who had not already fled, was emancipated by the advancing armies. What happened to Martha during this chaos remains partially obscured by the historical record. Her journal entries end abruptly in 1862 with a final cryptic passage: "The war is coming. When it arrives, all photographs will burn and all lies will be buried again. But I will write this down, and I will hide it where only the righteous might find it." She survived the war. This much is confirmed by census records from 1870, which list her as a freedwoman, age 59, literate, living in a small community approximately 15 miles from the ruins of the Wright plantation. She lived another 23 years, dying in 1893 at approximately 82 years old. But crucially, Martha never published her journal. She never came forward with testimony. She never organized her knowledge into a formal accusation. Why? The most likely explanation is fear. Fear of retaliation against surviving family members. Fear of the legal consequences of making such accusations. Fear of a culture that had no institutional mechanism to receive or validate the testimony of an enslaved or formerly enslaved woman against white testimony. The journal remained hidden, apparently stored in the care of a local church, passing through the hands of various caretakers, its significance unrecognized until Dr. Carver's discovery in 2023. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the Wright family's response was strategic and effective. Nathaniel Wright died in 1876, and his will made no mention of the complex reproductive genealogy that had characterized his life. Instead, his estate was divided among the 3 children who remained in Georgia and had survived the war, presenting them to the world as his legitimate heirs. The other 5 children, whose presence in the 1851 photograph had suggested family membership, were not mentioned. They had been systematically erased from the official genealogical record. The extended Wright family pursued a deliberate campaign of obscuration that lasted more than a century. They moved north and west, changed names, intermarried with other prominent families, and carefully cultivated a public image of respectability and distance from the plantation system. By the early 20th century, multiple branches of the Wright family tree had established themselves as educated professionals, lawyers, doctors, educators, business people in northern cities where their southern ancestry was irrelevant, and their role in slavery was neither known nor questioned. Simultaneously, the survivors of the Wright plantation and their descendants worked to preserve their own histories through oral tradition and fragmentary documentation. The enslaved and formerly enslaved population of rural Georgia had created their own informal archives, stories passed down through families, references preserved in church records, and community narratives. These accounts were never formally recognized as historical evidence. They were not published in academic journals or integrated into the official historical record, but they persisted, generation after generation, carrying within them the knowledge that the official record had deliberately excluded. The 1851 photograph remained in various archives, county records, historical societies, genealogical collections, visible to anyone who searched for it. Yet its true significance remained concealed. It was catalogued simply as Wright Family, 1851, with no annotation regarding its hidden truths. Genealogists who studied it made note of inconsistencies, but moved on without pursuing them. The photograph was, in a very real sense, in plain sight, a document of systematic deception that the institutional structures of historical documentation were designed to ignore. Chapter 6. The Descendant Who Questioned. everything. James Wright Jr. was born in 1952 in Boston, Massachusetts, to parents who had intentionally distanced themselves from their Southern ancestry. His father, Thomas Wright, had migrated north in 1930 and married a woman from a prominent African-American family in Boston, whose own heritage included New England abolitionists and educators. The Wright family's Southern origins were acknowledged but minimized, treated as historical curiosities rather than ongoing obligations. The plantation, the war, slavery itself, these were discussed as distant historical events, unfortunate but ultimately resolved, and therefore irrelevant to the present. James Jr. was trained as a civil rights lawyer in the 1970s, educated at prestigious universities where he studied constitutional law, civil rights theory, and social justice. He was intellectually and emotionally committed to confronting systemic racism and uncovering historical injustices perpetrated against Black Americans. Yet he had largely compartmentalized his family's role in that system, maintaining a psychological distance between the injustices he fought professionally and the injustices embedded in his own genealogy. In 1967, when James Jr. was 15 years old, his paternal grandmother passed away. Her estate contained various documents, including family records and genealogical notes accumulated over decades. His father, cleaning out the house, asked James Jr. to help organize these materials. In the process, James Jr. discovered references to the plantation, to Nathaniel Wright, to census records that seemed contradictory. Puzzled, he asked his father for clarification. His father's response was evasive, acknowledging the plantation's existence, but describing it vaguely as a complicated part of our history, and suggesting that detailed investigation was unnecessary and potentially harmful to the family's reputation. Unsatisfied, James Jr. commissioned a private genealogist in 1981, after his father's death, to research the family history comprehensively. The genealogist, an older woman named Ruth Foster, who had made a career of carefully documenting complex Southern family histories, spent more than a year investigating the Wright family's records. She discovered the inconsistencies in census records, the gaps in property documentation, the impossibility of explaining how certain individuals appeared in the 1851 photograph, yet disappeared from subsequent records. She discovered references in county court documents to property disputes involving disputed heirs and unclear lines of descent. She found whispered references in regional historical societies to rumors of mixed families and questionable legitimacy. Ruth Foster produced a 400-page report that meticulously documented these inconsistencies and proposed a hypothesis that the Wright family had a hidden genealogy involving undisclosed relationships between Nathaniel Wright and the enslaved women on his plantation. She was careful in her language, using clinical terminology and presenting the evidence as circumstantial. But the implications were unmistakable. The Wright family's prominence, their wealth, their integration into respectable society, all of this had been built partially on the systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women and the deliberate erasure of the resulting children. James Jr. read the report in private. He was devastated. He consulted with a psychologist about how to process this knowledge. He considered going public, but was dissuaded by his mother, who feared the damage to the family's reputation and to his own career prospects. Instead, he stored the report away in a locked filing cabinet and never shared it with his siblings or extended family. He did, however, integrate this knowledge into his legal work. He became increasingly focused on cases involving undocumented or deliberately concealed genealogies, inheritance disputes, cases where enslaved people's descendants sought recognition of their historical relationships. Colleagues noted that his passion for these cases seemed personal, though he never explained why. If this story has already captured you, leave a like It helps the story of the Wright family reach more people. Chapter 7. The Archive in the Church. The First Baptist Church of a small rural community in Georgia had been established in 1847, predating the Civil War by 14 years. It had served both enslaved and free black populations. Though worship had been segregated, the black congregation worshipping in a separate section of the building, often under the supervision of white church leaders. After emancipation, the church had become an independent institution serving the freed black community, and it accumulated over decades a remarkable archive of documents related to the community's history. Birth records, marriage certificates, letters, journals, and fragmentary records that the enslaved population had created or preserved despite the systematic attempt to deny them literacy and historical agency. The church building itself had survived the Civil War and subsequent historical upheavals, though it had been damaged by fire in 1921 and subsequently rebuilt. During that reconstruction, various documents had been placed in a metal chest in the church basement for preservation. These documents accumulated over decades, some organized, many not. By the early 21st century, the church basement contained an unarchived, largely uncatalogued collection of materials spanning more than 150 years of community history. Dr. Eleanor Carver, a historian specializing in the genealogy of enslaved populations, had begun research in 2019 on the documented experiences of midwives during slavery, women who had possessed crucial knowledge and authority despite being trapped within systems of enslavement. She traveled throughout Georgia seeking primary sources, journals, letters, medical records, anything documented by midwives themselves. Her research brought her to this church in the fall of 2022, where she had been informed that historical documents related to enslaved people's lives might be preserved. The church's pastor, a man named Reverend David Thompson, gave her access to the basement. What she found was extraordinary. Dozens of journals, letters, and fragmentary documents spanning from the 1840s through the 1970s. Among these materials, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and placed in a small wooden box, she discovered Martha's journal. The initial excitement of finding a primary source from an enslaved midwife was tempered by the difficulty of deciphering the text. Martha had written in a deliberate code, using gula phrases, grammatical inversions, and symbolic language clearly designed to obscure meaning from any reader who might discover the journal without proper context. It took Dr. Carver 3 months of careful study, consultation with linguistic specialists, and research into Martha's life to decode the essential meaning of the journal's entries. As the meaning became clear, Dr. Carver realized she had discovered something potentially transformative: documentary evidence of a systematic program of reproductive coercion written by an eyewitness, preserved through more than 150 years of American history. She contacted the Wright family through various channels, explaining her discovery and requesting permission to publish the findings. The family's response was mixed. Some descendants expressed interest in historical accuracy and transparency. Others demanded that publication be delayed or prevented entirely. One descendant, a prominent attorney in Atlanta, sent a cease and desist letter suggesting that publication would constitute defamation. The dispute remained unresolved for several months. Meanwhile, Dr. Carver continued her research, cross-referencing Martha's accounts with census records, property documents, and DNA evidence, testing whether the biological relationships Martha had documented could be confirmed through modern genetic analysis. The results were definitive. Several descendants of the modern Wright family who had agreed to testing demonstrated genetic relationships to the descendants of enslaved people on the Wright plantation, confirming Martha's coded account with scientific precision. In early 2024, Dr. Carver published a preliminary article in an academic journal detailing her findings. the article generated significant media attention, particularly in genealogical and historical communities. It became the basis for ongoing research, public forums, and discussions about how to acknowledge undisclosed genealogies and address historical injustices perpetrated through reproductive coercion. The 1851 photograph, once merely a curiosity in archival collections, became a central document in conversations about how photographs encode and conceal historical truths. Chapter 8. What the Descendants Discovered. The publication of Dr. Carver's findings created a crisis within the extended Wright family. For some descendants, the revelations were devastating, not merely as historical facts, but as personal identities shattered. Those who had believed themselves to be purely descended from Nathaniel Wright's legitimate children learned that their family tree was substantially more complex and more morally fraught than they had imagined. More significantly, they learned that their family's wealth and prominence had been built partially on the systematic exploitation of enslaved women, whose descendants were still identifiable, still alive, still carrying the consequences of this history. Some family members responded with denial. They hired their own genealogists and historians to challenge Dr. Carver's findings, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that Martha's journal was an unreliable source written by someone with a potentially biased perspective. These arguments were scientifically and historically weak. The DNA evidence was definitive, and Martha's account had been carefully corroborated through multiple independent sources. Yet denial persisted, particularly among those whose identities or inheritances felt most threatened by the revelations. Other family members responded with efforts toward reparative justice. A descendant named Catherine Wright Martin, a philanthropist and educator in North Carolina, established a foundation specifically designed to address the historical injustices perpetrated by her family. She began researching the descendants of the enslaved people on the Wright plantation, identifying surviving families and working toward meaningful acknowledgement and reparation. She funded scholarships for descendants of enslaved people to pursue higher education. She commissioned oral histories from community members whose ancestors had been enslaved. She worked to ensure that Martha's story and the stories of the enslaved population on the Wright plantation were preserved and taught. Catherine Wright Martin also worked toward something more radical: the formal acknowledgement of the Wright family's role in reproductive coercion and its consequences. She connected descendants of enslaved women with descendants of Nathaniel Wright, facilitating conversations about shared genealogies and shared humanity. These conversations were often painful, marked by conflicting emotions and complicated histories, but they represented an unprecedented effort within American family genealogy to acknowledge historical injustices, not as abstract historical events, but as lived experiences that had shaped contemporary families and relationships. Dr. Carver's research also prompted broader conversations about the Wright plantation itself. A descendant and historian named Michael Wright, working with historians at the University of Georgia, began the process of documenting the plantation's full history. They interviewed elderly people who had been born in the area and whose family members had been enslaved there. They conducted archaeological surveys. They discovered cemetery sites and the remains of enslaved people's quarters. They uncovered additional documentation that corroborated and expanded upon Martha's account. The most significant discovery came in 2024, when archaeologists, working in a field approximately half a mile from the plantation house ruins, located a burial site containing the remains of approximately 87 individuals. Preliminary analysis suggested these were enslaved people who had died on the plantation between approximately 1820 and 1865. DNA testing revealed genetic relationships between individuals in the burial site, and documented descendants of the enslaved population. The site had been completely absent from official plantation records, as if these deaths had not officially occurred, as if these people had been buried in unmarked graves outside the acknowledged geography of the plantation. The discovery of the burial site transformed the public conversation. The Wright plantation was no longer merely an abstract historical location, but a literal landscape of death and violation. The official silence regarding these graves became itself a historical fact, requiring explanation and acknowledgement. Local historians began working toward formal documentation of the site and recognition of its significance. Plans were developed for a memorial, acknowledging the enslaved people who had died there and the histories of violence embedded in that geography. Chapter 9. The photograph speaks again. The 1851 photograph of the Wright family, which had hung in obscurity for more than 170 years, became the centerpiece of an exhibition in 2024 at a regional historical museum. The exhibition, titled "What Photographs Conceal? Genealogy Deception," and the 1851 Wright family portrait, placed the photograph in dialogue with Martha's journal, DNA evidence, census records, and oral histories. Visitors could examine the photograph alongside documentation that explained in detail which individuals in the photograph had been whose biological children, which relationships had been concealed, which people had been subsequently sold or erased. The exhibition transformed the photograph from a static document into an active site of investigation and meaning-making. Descendants of both the Wright family and the enslaved population on the Wright plantation attended the exhibition together. They stood before the photograph and discussed its implications. Some descendants of enslaved people recognized features in the faces pictured, echoes of their own ancestors, echoes of genealogical connections that had been systematically denied and concealed. Descendants of the Wright family confronted the visual evidence of their family's crimes and the human cost of those crimes. The photograph's journey from obscurity to prominence represented something broader, the beginning of a process of reckoning with the hidden genealogies and reproductive violence embedded in the history of American slavery. If one photograph could conceal such truths for 174 years, how many other photographs, documents, and archives were similarly encoding concealed histories? How many other families carried within their genealogies undisclosed relationships, hidden children, systematic reproductive violations? Martha's journal, preserved in the church basement and discovered only in 2023, represented a rare instance in which an enslaved person's testimony had survived and eventually been heard. But it also represented a tragedy, that such knowledge had to be hidden, coded, and deferred for more than 150 years before it could be acknowledged and acted upon. Martha had lived her entire life knowing truths that the world would not listen to. She had written them down, knowing that her writing itself was an act of resistance and rebellion. She had hidden her testimony in a place of faith, perhaps trusting that eventually righteousness would locate what injustice had concealed. The Wright family's descendants, contemporary descendants living in 2025, now carry a different burden than their ancestors. They carry the knowledge of what their wealth was built upon. They carry the responsibility of acknowledging and addressing historical injustices. Some embrace this responsibility, others resist it. But all of them live in a changed landscape, one in which the photograph speaks openly about what it had concealed, one in which Martha's voice, transmitted through her journal across more than 150 years, finally demands to be heard. Dr. Elena Carver continues her research into the genealogies of reproductive violence during slavery, identifying other plantations where similar patterns may have occurred, and other archives where testimonies similar to Martha's may be hidden, waiting to be discovered. The Wright plantation burial site remains under careful study, with plans to provide proper reburial and memorialization for the individuals whose remains were discovered there. Catherine Wright Martin continues her work toward reparative justice, acknowledging that no amount of contemporary effort can undo historical violence, but that honest confrontation with that violence remains essential. The photograph of 1851, the image that Nathaniel Wright commissioned to project an image of dynastic legitimacy, has become instead an image of concealment, deception, and systematic violation. It speaks now, across 174 years, not of what it was intended to communicate, but of what it was designed to hide. In that transformation, the photograph becomes a document not of family stability, but of family trauma, not of inherited honor, but of inherited violence, not of legitimacy, but of profound and systemic lies. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Wright family and the testimony of Martha, the enslaved midwife who remembered what official history tried to forget. We'll see you in the next video.